My favorite part of the show, money, power, politics. The NFL kicked off a new season last night, and Nike's new ad made its television debut.
If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything.
The narrator and new focus, of course, is Colin Kaepernick. He's an outspoken advocate for social justice. This is the guy who began his protests in 2016 by kneeling during the national anthem. And President Trump, of course, has been very outspoken against such protests almost as long. The president once again took aim at Kaepernick, the NFL, and Nike last night in Montana.
Mr. President, tonight is the first NFL game. They don't have as many viewers as they used to have. But from Colin Kaepernick to the NFL to now Nike, who's going to win this cultural showdown of standing for the anthem? We are.
I don't know what the NFL is doing. Honestly, I don't know what the NFL is doing. I don't like what Nike did. I don't think it's appropriate what they did. I honor the flag. I honor our national anthem, and most of the people in this country feel the same way.
Joining me now, my dear friend and co-founder of Risk Reversal, Dan Nathan and Midwin Charles, still with me. Dan, to you first. The president says, I don't like what Nike did. Nike took a page directly from Donald Trump's playbook. They said something controversial and generated a massive amount of free press. It has been estimated $163 million worth of free buzz from this. That is President Trump's jam. How could he not like it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is one of the largest multinationals in the world, 130 billion market cap company. They sell over, or they're going to sell about $40 billion in footwear and apparel this year. And I think what's really important about that is 60% of those sales come from outside of North America, right? So when you think about this, the president wants to make this a referendum on patriotism. I think what Nike wants to do is make it a referendum on the values that this country is founded on. And that to me is what I think is the most important aspect about this.
But isn't Nike really just trying to change the conversation in that Nike's no angel here? Look at the issues that Nike has right now. The amount of management changes they have had to have because of sexual harassment issues, Me Too issues. We're not talking about that. It's masterful that Nike has said, this is what we stand for, and people are clinging to it, forgetting that, I mean, come on, like, this is a company that is not without their own problems.
They're not a perfect company, that's for sure. I mean, we all know that they also, abuse labor in poor countries in order to make those sneakers and to make their apparel. But I think what they are doing is sort of standing by their slogan, which is just do it. What should not get lost in this conversation is that Colin Kaepernick is talking about social justice. He's talking about African-American men and women and children who are shot, who are unarmed, who are shot by police. And important to remember this, no accountability when that happens. There's rarely any ever accountability. He has never said, I can't stand the anthem. I hate that part where it says when the rockets regular. I mean, he doesn't, this is not, for Trump and I think his supporters to kind of take this and sort of hijack it and say that he is protesting the flag and he's protesting the anthem. It is factually incorrect. If anyone just takes the time to listen to what it is that he said, he's saying that, he wants social justice for all. Why is that such a radical thing in 2018?
Dan, shareholders don't care. Shareholders just want sneakers sold. But is it a risk that a company like this starts to weigh in on political issues? Because the next hot button issue, are we then going to say, Nike, what do you have to say? And do other consumer product companies now feel like they have to weigh in? It's dicey.
Yeah, I actually don't think so, and I'll tell you why. I mean, look at some of their biggest endorsements. Look at LeBron. Look at Serena. I mean, these are people who are very comfortable speaking out about social issues. And so what they're doing, I think, is reframing the narrative around what they think is a key demographic going forward, especially here in North America. When you think about this never again, how this kind of really took over in America, they're tapping into this younger sort of consumer that is focused on these issues in a way we haven't seen in a very long time. So to me, I see that as a very smart reframing of this whole debate.
Well, it's not new from the president. We have seen the president bashing the NFL, bashing players. Is this a winning strategy for him. I mean, he can go up there and say, well, the ratings are way down. The ratings were already down. Your kids don't play football. My kids don't play football. When my husband was growing up, he played football. He loved football. It was his sport. I don't have a single friend whose sons play football at this point, and it has nothing to do with Colin Kaepernick or the flag. It has to do with head injuries. Is the president successful here at, again, conflating issues to make it a winning argument for him?
I think he's successful with his base. I think what he does is he sort of harps on these issues that work very well for his base, that keeps his base united. He cannot remain in that White House if he does not have the full support of his base. And so what
but
he does
his base
is
is not enough to win. It has to be more than his
but
base.
it's enough to keep him just there. All he needs to do is constantly spew things that are not true, lies, right? Nobody wants to say lie anymore. I don't understand why. It's
We do,
2018.
lies. He told almost 5,000.
You know, he just keeps telling these lies over and over again. His base believes it. They keep repeating it, and it works for him. Why would he stop?
Well, I think what's really important about it with his base is that they are not beneficiaries of this tax cut. They wouldn't have been beneficiaries of repeal and replace of Obamacare. These are topics that into the midterms are not particularly popular with his base, and it's one of the reasons why I think Republicans feel more comfortable with some of these cultural issues, because they will not waver on these, and he will continue to press them as he did during the campaign in 2016 and throughout last year. So at the end of the day, you got to think about what are the policies that they've enacted in the first 2 years of his administration, and none of them are particularly positive or you know, they belie a lot of his populist
His
message.
bifurcated strategy works.
It does.
He has a cultural argument that works for his base and financial policies that work for corporate America and the rich.
That's right.
That gets him over the top.
Which, by the way, is in essence the Republican Party. For a long time, the Republican Party has done very well with cultural issues such as abortion and things like that, whereas their policies have been financial and have hurt a lot of these people who support the party, the main basis of this party.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.